Human beings. We're made of many layers. There are always levels to our thoughts and feelings, and that includes our desires. One such desire is to be good, or at least to appear to others as good. One way of being good is to be just and to uphold justice. But how do we know what justice is? When we are harmed by others, and we harm them in repayment, at what point does justice become its own unforgivable crime? Brianna, hearing the distant, dulled notes of a player piano, considered for the umpteenth time how strange it was that her husband insisted on moving them to France, when the house and garden they bought seemed in every way a slice of upper-class, respectable England transported across the Channel. Everything from the neat lawns, the orderly hedgerows, and the tomb-like structure of the big house oozed Englishness. One part grand, another part unbearably dull, just like her life. She sighed and pushed the air hard out of her lungs before putting her shoulder up against the gallery door. She pushed. As usual, it didn't budge for a second. Then, with unexpected vigor, it swung open and crashed against the inner wall, creating a sound that made her drive her head down between her shoulders and bring her hands to her head. "Bloody door!" she cried out, to be answered only by an echo. With the absence of her husband Maxwell, he was on a trip abroad, and her children away to boarding school, she had taken to screaming. There was something exciting about behaving unacceptably in a big place, alone, and getting away with it. It was a shame, however, that it was always followed by a hint of sadness that nobody had noticed. That's the flip side of being alone. She moved inside and, with ease, closed the gallery door. She cursed it for its inconsistency and moved forward. This was both her favourite and least favourite part of the house. It had her admiration for its intent and her condemnation for its execution. It was envisaged as a miniature version of the upper gallery of the Louvre, where Maxwell could display some of the rare trinkets his enterprising family had collected over the years. She closed her eyes and imagined it. How wonderful to have such a slice of culture right beside one's own house and home. She opened her eyes. Unfortunately, Maxwell suffered from chronic poor taste and had no ability to recognize it. As such, he insisted on personally inputting on its design. Somehow the result seemed like a grand marble and wood panel-lined version of an overly grand parking garage. At least, she comforted herself. The collection itself was impressive all on its own. She passed by a cabinet full of round, polished circles and bowls. The label, "Suspected Ancient Remote Viewing Lenses," was embossed on a metal strip screwed into its base. Beyond that was a desiccated grey hand suspended on a wire. "The Golem's Paw," read the description. Next was a display case with extra security measures, including a cordoned-off, 2-metre squared no-go zone around it. Encased in a double layer of bulletproof glass was a strip of leather bound between 2 glass rods. Barely visible on the leather was a rough-etched image of some wild animal. The description read, "Positively, do not open." She hurried on swiftly. She could never look at it for longer than a few minutes without feeling the urge to panic. What she really came to see were the paintings. Well, one painting in particular. not more than 10 by 10 centimeters. It was wedged subtly between much larger, greater pieces, almost like it did not want to be seen. It depicted a verdant landscape of rolling hills in the background. In the foreground was a small grouping of trees that overhung an aged marble tomb. Leaning against its edge was a young man, and beside him, a smiling young woman. Brianna's smile matched the girl's when she looked at it. She vividly remembered posing for that painting alongside Philippe. She had just about turned 19 at the time, and Philippe was on the cusp of 21. She smiled even wider, but in a sad way, when she recalled the fact that she was pregnant and had not yet told her family. How naive she was, that such concern seemed to her at the time to be earth-shattering. She reached out a finger and slowly stroked the glass frame above where Philippe was depicted. They were so happy, so in love, and so totally ignorant of the world that lay beneath. It was mere days after they had posed for the painting that Maxwell Butterworth had appeared, with his rowdy band of aristocratic hangers-on, asking to see the tomb. She was swiftly brought out of her memory by the sound of something hard striking glass. With a yelp, she turned around. The only sound was her breathing, but she noticed some pigeons at one of the gallery's windows. She released her breath. Why was she so tense and jumpy today? She didn't know. Maybe she had too much or not enough coffee. She moved on from the painting and crossed the center of the gallery. She passed by a crumbling marble statue of an angelic woman being held on the shoulders of a troop of 6 rugged, savage-looking men. She cut through a collection of cabinets holding disturbingly shrunken, bulbous heads, and towards a display in the far right corner. It was a rough-cut, limestone tomb. Impressive and anonymous at the same time. It was decorated, but unlettered. It was covered in carved designs, but seemingly not of any one subject. She leaned up against it, like she used to, and closed her eyes. She pictured that Philippe was standing there beside her, and that the stale, cool air of the gallery was actually the warm kiss of a summer breeze. She forced the smell of industrial cleaning fluid and floor wax out of her mind, and pictured the scent of wild garlic growing mere meters away. She reached out her hand to place it on top of her lover's, the man who she hoped would soon be her husband. Instead, she felt it land on the hardness of the stone. Of course, he wasn't there. Her memory jumped to Maxwell Butterworth, staring down at the tomb with lustful eyes. He circled it like a predator, feeling its edges, knocking on its lid, and pushing on the corners. "Put it in the van, boys," Maxwell snapped at his lackeys, who started setting up the heavy lift gear. "What are you doing?" Philip demanded. "We haven't agreed on a sale. My family has been looking after this for—" "Your family can buy a big house somewhere far away, and you can consider your old burden lifted," Maxwell interrupted and pushed a case into Philippe's hands. He opened it, and he nearly fell backwards. It was filled with $100 bills. I can't," Philippe said. "Very well then," Maxwell shrugged, grabbing the bag of money back. "We're taking it anyway. And no money for you." Philippe was then forced to look on, helpless, as the men loaded the tomb, the item he was born to watch over, onto a truck, and then he saw it drive off beyond the horizon. It is one thing to see someone become sad, or even deeply depressed, but quite another to witness a man be truly broken. Philippe was broken. Of all the generations in his family, it was he who failed. The one weak link in a long chain. Brianna recalled that when she looked at his face, she loved him. But when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a dead man who, by some unhappy accident, was still breathing. That sort of despair slowly kills you. By the time he aged another year, he looked middle-aged, and he spoke with a voice so weak that it was as if he were already elderly. Brianna momentarily snapped out of a reminiscence. A strange sound, a mixture of rumbling and tearing, could just about be heard. That was odd. Perhaps there were roadworks nearby. She shrugged and moved away from the tomb. She cut across displays, showing a collection of drawings and photographs, showing sinister, shadowy figures lingering in doorways and corners. She arrived at the centre of the room, where Maxwell's prized piece sat, an enormous sculpture of black obsidian and quartz crystal depicting what looked like an oily tornado, reaching down to strike a human figure below it, changing and warping his form in a grotesque manner. She could never decide whether the figure's facial expression showed pain or some sort of maniacal joy. Either way, she was certain that the face displayed a sense of deliberateness and purpose. Just a year after the tomb had been taken, Brianna recalled that Philippe had called her name from where he was lying sick in bed. She had gone up to him, her soul heavy with grief at his waning vitality. But when she opened the door, she saw the dying man look at her in that deliberate, purposeful way. "I need you to do something you won't like," he said, "but please, do it for me." Brianna had listened to his unusual request, and it truly was a monumental ask. Find Maxwell Butterworth and find a way to get into his good graces. Philippe said that he had noticed how he had lustfully looked at her when he had come to take the tomb. Perhaps the best way was to seduce him. Then, once in his inner circle, guard the tomb in secret. Protect it, like he did, right under Maxwell's nose, and then pass the duty on to your children. The memory of the pain she felt when she walked out of the room for the last time, knowing she would not be there for his final days, crippled her. Even worse, she spent a year traipsing around country to country, following the socialite Maxwell's debauched path through Europe's pubs and brothels. Eventually she did find him, and posing as a swooning maiden besotted by a man of such wealth, she got him to take the bait. Eventually, they married, and she even bore 2 of his children. She had given up Philippe's child, who was born mere months before she left. So, she had lived a lie ever since, lying beside a man who, inside, she did not truly love. Indeed, she utterly despised. All because of Philippe. It was a heavy burden, and yet onward she carried it. The tomb would be protected. Philippe had instructed her on how to prevent the Butterworths from ever discovering its secrets. As long as she breathed, she swore, they never would. Before the memories could make her too tearful, Brianna was spooked by the sound of something crashing outside the gallery. She jogged over to a side door and opened it, and peered down one of the maintenance corridors. Several roof panels had come down, and were lying broken on the ground. The place was falling apart. Maxwell truly was incompetent when it came to real estate, she thought with disgust. But another sound got her spinning around wildly. Footsteps. Rapid, almost as if they were jogging. But where were they coming from? It must be from above, she decided. Brianna ran back into the gallery, and up the stairs to the upper level, which was a balcony overlooking the lower floor. It was filled with Maxwell's rare coin collection, as well as a selection of items stolen by the Nazis during World War II. Maxwell's grandfather had used his connections to funnel some of that contraband into his own hands, instead of letting them go to waste by having them returned to their rightful owners. The roof of the upper gallery was slanted, and plastered over it was a gigantic oil painting they had commissioned a few years before. It was the entire Butterworth family, from the American to the British to the French branches. All of them who mattered were there. On the left-hand side was Maxwell, beside his glowering younger brother James, who seemed resentful for having to pose for the painting. From here, Brianna could hear the footsteps clearly. She could even detect their faint echo bouncing off the walls. Somebody was walking. Just behind a display showing the panels from the Amber Room, originally taken by the Germans from St. Petersburg. Suddenly, the steps went quiet, as if the walker had stopped and stood still. Then from out of sight came a shrill female voice. "How many Butterworths does it take to change a light bulb?" This strange statement was followed by a bang and a flash. Brianna yelped in fright, but her attention was brought to the roof, which was making an alarming groaning noise. She looked up. A chandelier stolen from a Polish cathedral was dangling awkwardly from its chain. Another bang shook Brianna's body, and she saw the top of the light fittings spark. Then she understood that somebody was shooting at it. Then it came loose and began to fall. With a scream that would have made a hyena proud, Brianna threw herself out of the way, just as the crystalline metal mass impacted the ground, spreading its seeds wide, like the waves when you drop a stone into still water. She heard the footsteps again, running. Panicked, instinct took over, and Brianna jumped to her feet, slipping and sliding over bits of broken crystal. She just about fell down the stairs to the lower gallery, aware that the steps were gaining on her. Another bang went off somewhere behind her, and she noticed a nearby cabinet having its glass explode right next to her. She threw herself over a wide, low cabinet displaying secret historical documents signed by world governments and various secret societies, and landed painfully on the floor. "Why are you running?" the mysterious voice demanded. "Is this what the famous Butterworth hospitality is really like? I am not impressed." The stranger fired off a few more shots, shattering vases, cracking statues, and puncturing priceless artwork. When the stranger seemed satisfied, her footsteps started walking closer. "Itty bitty Butterworths, come out and play," the voice mocked. Brianna cursed Maxwell in her head. Where was security? Was he so cheap that he hired cowards who fled? Or were they just weaklings who got taken down by one intruder? A poor way to die, the victim of your billionaire husband's cheap streak. The footsteps were nearly at her position now. There had to be something she could do. She just had to think. Yes, think. What was around her that she could use to defend herself? To her right, hung from an iron prong, was a Byzantine sword, supposedly made by an Arab alchemist to give the wielder supernatural strength. She definitely could use that at that moment. She took a deep breath, and with a lurch, she called on all the courage she had. She couldn't afford to die. She needed to protect the tomb. And so she leapt to the side and yanked the sword down. It was stupidly heavy. So in a panic, she twisted her hips and just lobbed its mass towards her attacker. The intruder easily dodged it, but it was a good enough diversion to allow Brianna to make a fresh run for it without getting shot point blank. She had been a fine runner in her teenage years, but she had not exactly maintained the same stamina since. At that moment, she'd have done her younger self proud. She pounded down the gallery. Considering the swearing she heard behind her, she had managed to put some distance between herself and the assailant. However, her newfound speed became her undoing, as her momentum prevented her from veering around the cordoned-off display containing the strange leather strip. Her feet caught on the rope, and she fell straight in her face, blasting the wind out of her chest when she hit the ground. She heard the attacker laughing at her prey's mistake, as the footsteps quickly drew closer. Coughing and gasping, Brianna dragged herself towards the display case and slumped against it. It was too late. The intruder was there, standing in front of her. The form was clearly female, dressed fully in black, with a balaclava over her head. Her sneering grin and flaming eyes were the only visible parts of her body. They were all that was needed to communicate that this woman was a demon walking upon the earth. It didn't help that she was also pointing a gun right at Brianna. The Butterworths didn't make it to the Olympics this season. Too bad, she sneered. Time slows in your final moments. The mere instant it takes to pull the trigger that will send you to the grave seems near eternal. Brianna looked up, not wanting the last thing she saw to be that leering, hateful face. Instead, she saw the words. Positively, do not open. Never had her insides leapt with joy to be so close to such an insidious artifact. So much so, she even smiled back at the attacker. The rictus got her assailant's attention for the split second she needed to slam her hand against the latch, knocking it out of place. The display cabinet drifted open. The sound in the room seemed to disappear, and it felt like she were underwater. But the smell was burning. A horrific pong of burning fat and muscle, of incinerated bone, the crackle of melting hair, and the popping of boiling eyeballs. Screams entered her head, sounds of pain so unimaginable that it nearly made her pass out where she sat. However, her plight was nothing compared to that of her attacker, who was staring right at the monstrous artifact. She had her hands on her head, and she was screaming incoherently for it to stop. This was her chance. She could get away if she could just get further from the display cabinet. Finally, she managed to throw herself over the barrier, and feeling lighter, she got on her feet and jogged away. She was still too winded to run properly, but the attacker was so overcome by the object that she didn't even notice Brianna leaving. She arrived at the big gallery doors, and with all her strength, heaved them open. Thankfully, they closed very easily. The doors banged shut, and she heard the electronic bolt engage. Brianna slumped against a nearby wall, hysterical with terror and shock. She had no idea what was happening or what she should do or think. She screamed out into nowhere for help. Nobody answered. "Security!" she bellowed. Just where were they? She wondered. She decided that finding them was probably the best thing to do in this situation. So she moved as quickly as she could down the corridor, away from the gallery, towards the house. She opened the door and entered the mansion's main atrium. At least the psycho was trapped in the gallery. She had time to act. She saw the telephone on the opposite wall. She ran over to it and lifted it. The line was dead. Brianna recalled all the strange noises she had heard before the intrusion. No doubt she had made sure to cut the house's phone line before attacking. She realized then that she was dealing with an expert killer. If the phone wasn't working, she needed to get to the security station on the other side of the house. She might, at least, be able to barricade herself in there. She moved across the atrium, some of the pain from her previous ordeal starting to tax her, but she struggled on. Then, she heard the mansion's intercom system engage. For a moment, she thought it was security, but her heart sank when she heard the sneering voice of the attacker. "You don't die easily, do you, Butterworth? I didn't waltz through the front door. I came through the roof. I just left the way I came." The system was then cut out, and its sound was replaced with that of rapidly oncoming footsteps. Brianna swore in frustration. The attacker was coming from the direction she was going. Having no choice, she took off up the main staircase. Perhaps she could take a roundabout route to security. She found herself in the upper corridor, which was an oak-panelled tribute to Maxwell's narcissism. The walls were adorned with pictures of himself and his life. Decorations on little tables displayed the various awards he had achieved for the hard work of donating to various causes in the name of his own vanity. The doors mostly led to unused bedrooms, designed to accommodate visiting family members, or to shelter Maxwell's aristocratic friends when they came over for a particularly raucous party and felt too delicate afterwards to make their way home. As Brianna reached halfway down the corridor, she could see the old servants' elevator, which back in the day was used to send food up from the kitchens without the residents having to suffer the indignity of looking at the house's staff. Just as she drew parallel with it, its oak door blasted open, and the attacker, like a cougar leaping for the kill, launched out of it, grazing Brianna's shoulder and sending her stumbling hard into the solid doorframe of one of the rooms. "A handy shortcut," the attacker growled, launching herself at Brianna. With absolutely no time to spare, Brianna opened the door she had impacted, slamming it shut hard. She heard and felt the attacker's body collide with the door, followed by a muffled grunt of pain. Brianna hastily fastened the lock. She was safe. For a few seconds at least. She looked around, her body covered in sweat and her breathing ragged and heaving. She was in one of the guest bedrooms. A quirk of these old buildings was that the corridor was not the only way the rooms were connected. Each had a little door in the corner, which entered into the next bedroom. With any luck, the attacker didn't know that, and Brianna could sneak through the 3 guest rooms and into the music room at the end, then back out into the corridor and down the small auxiliary staircase. That should bring her out, right in front of the security station. Before she could move, however, she heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by something being disturbed on the wall outside. Then the door shook, accompanied by an ear-splitting bang, and she noticed the wood warped very slightly. With horror, Brianna realized the attacker must have taken the fire axe, which hung on the wall outside, and was using it to break down the door. Another bang tore through her ears, and a section of the door bulged inward. There was no time left. She had to move. She scrambled over to the corner and pushed a table out of the way, which was blocking the unused door, and she pulled it open. She shouldered through the painting that had been hanging over the other side, leapt over the next guest bed, and made for the next door. This one wasn't blocked, so she shouldered her way through it. The last bedroom was unfurnished. Even better, a straight line to the music room. She darted across and through the door. The player piano was still going, the way she had left it. The various musical instruments attached to the walls glinted with class. A great harp graced the other corner, and in the centre was Maxwell's pride, a sleek, grand piano. Brianna ignored the lot, however, and she made for the door back into the corridor. Just as she reached it, however, it was blown open. Brianna leapt back to avoid its inward swing. Looming in the open doorway stood the attacker, her eyes burning with vengeance. "How did—" Brianna gasped in total disbelief. She saw the attacker's mouth contort into a smile through the balaclava. "There's usually a copy of the blueprints for old buildings in local government archives. Doesn't take long to make a request and get to know the layout," the attacker sneered, stepping forward. Brianna stepped back, trying not to panic. The attacker was within striking distance, and the deadly fire axe was clutched in one hand. Still, the assailant walked forward. and Brianna walked back. Before she could formulate some sort of escape plan, she felt her lower back come up against the edge of the grand piano. She was cornered. The attacker made a satisfied sigh at seeing her prey caught in her trap. She leant forward, relishing in Brianna's terror. As she leant forward, Brianna leant back until she was leaning half inside the piano's body. Perfect, the attacker thought. With a sudden swipe of the axe, which made Brianna squeal as it zoomed past, the attacker severed the support stick, keeping the piano's lid suspended in the air. It came down, crushing Brianna's arms and pinning her in place with its great weight. She let out a soul-wrenching scream of pain as her shoulder joints popped out of their sockets, the left first and then the right. The attacker grabbed Brianna's chin and forced it upwards until their two eyes met. "What's your name?" the attacker asked. Brianna? She replied shakily, her body racked with agony. Brianna? The attacker seemed to swirl the word around in her mouth. I like that. They didn't give me a name. Slaves don't need them. But it's better to have no name than be called Butterworth. The attacker then stood up straight and raised the axe into the air, its blade silhouetted against the music room's window. Brianna closed her eyes. "Philippe," she whispered, "I failed. I can't protect the—" Before Brianna could finish the sentence, the axe swung and caved in her skull with the sound of breaking ice over a frozen lake. The player piano played on, as Brianna hung, crucified on the grand piano, a fire axe embedded in her head, and one tear hanging from her still, lifeless left eye.